to Roll Credits, where movie lovers get the trivia they didn't know they needed. Made with a little help from AI, so double check your facts. Today, we're diving into the Tron trilogy. Did you know the original 1982 film was one of the first to use extensive computer-generated imagery, so much so that it wasn't even nominated for a VFX Oscar? And before we get into it, drop a comment with what we should cover next, old or new.
It is wild to think about that Oscar snub now, especially considering what we're going to cover today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are taking a deep dive into the 40-year architectural, technological, and really the philosophical evolution of this entire franchise. We are tracking this journey from a glowing analog idea of cyberspace all the way to the very gritty, real-world AI invasion of Tron errors.
Right, and it really is a trajectory that is, unlike anything else in film history. This franchise didn't just predict the digital revolution. It actually had to invent the visual language for it, like while the tech itself was still basically in its infancy.
Yeah, the technology was barely there. But to really trace that evolution, we kind of have to bypass the basic plot summaries, right? Because anyone listening to this already knows about Kevin Flynn getting zapped into the grid by the Master Control Program.
Exactly. Instead of the basic plot, we need to look at what the director, Steven Lisberger, was actually trying to do. He wasn't just making a standard sci-fi movie. He actually viewed Flynn's journey as a shamanic quest.
Wait, a shamanic quest? I mean, that sounds way more mystical than just some hacker trying to steal his code back from a corporate mainframe.
I know it sounds crazy, but it is entirely mystical in its structure. Lisberger basically conceived of this digital world as a spirit realm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Flynn stepping into the grid, he operates almost like a digital Wizard of Oz. He crosses this threshold from the physical world into an unseen microcosm.
Right, to resolve that fundamental conflict, the one between the users who are basically the human creators acting like gods, and the programs, right, the digital subjects trapped in those rigid rules.
Precisely. The programs are totally bound by their environment. But trying to realize that spirit realm visually back in 1982, I mean, that is where the sheer madness of the production comes in.
Madness is the right word for it, because today, if a digital artist needs a light cycle, they just open a 3D modeling program, grab a stylus, and sculpt it in real time. They can literally spin it around to see how the light hits it.
Right, but in 1982, there was no graphical user interface. There was absolutely no screen to look at while you were building a 3D model.
Which is just, it's mind-bending. How on earth did they actually generate the 15 minutes of computer-generated imagery in that first film then?
Well, the process was agonizingly mathematical. To create a digital environment, the animators, led by guys like Bill Croyer, they had to rely on a process that felt way more like civil engineering than animation.
Civil engineering, what do you mean?
I mean, they literally started with physical graph paper. They would hand draw the objects they wanted, like a tank or a recognizer, and then they had to manually identify the critical points of those objects on an X, Y, and Z axis.
Wait, so they're literally plotting three-dimensional coordinates on flat paper? By hand?
Yes, by hand. They calculated the exact coordinates and angles for every single element, frame by frame. And since film runs at 24 frames per second, they had to calculate the shift in those coordinates 24 times just for 1 second of movement.
That is, I mean, I can't even fathom the patience required for that.
It gets worse.
Ah.
Once they had those numbers written out on physical sheets of paper, computer engineers would sit at dumb terminals. These were keyboards hooked up to mainframes with absolutely no visual display.
So they are just typing blind.
Exactly. They manually typed the coordinates in, about 600 numbers, just to generate 4 seconds of graphics.
That is like trying to build a modern smartphone using only medieval blacksmithing tools. It's like choreographing a complex ballet by mailing letters to the dancers one step at a time.
That is a brilliant analogy. And the kicker is, you don't even get to see if the dance worked until way later. They would run the batch process overnight, print the resulting images onto 35mm film, and project it the next day.
Oh my God. So they only find out the next day if it worked.
Right. Only then would they know if someone had, accidentally typed a 4 instead of a 5. Which would obviously send a digital light cycle just flying off into the stratosphere.
Just one typo and the whole shot is ruined. And that wasn't even the hardest part, was it? Because I know different effects companies handled different sequences, and they all had their own massive limitations.
Yeah, precisely. A company called MGI handled a lot of the fast-paced vehicle stuff because their system used mathematical primitives, like spheres and cones, that they could stick together. But another company, Triple I, had this punishingly difficult system.
Right. Didn't they handle the villain Sark's massive carrier ship, the scene where it de-reses or dematerializes?
They did, and they hit a massive wall with that. AAA's rendering software couldn't just draw vector outlines and make them disappear. To get that wireframe look, they actually had to model each individual line as a solid three-dimensional cylinder.
Wait, are you serious? So it wasn't actually hollow?
Not at all. They built this massive volume out of tiny digital pipes just to make it look like a hollow wireframe. Also, they could mathematically break it apart on screen.
The processing power required for that in 1982 must have been absolutely staggering. But here's the wild part to me. When people watch that original movie, almost everyone assumes the glowing neon circuit lines on the actor suits are early CGI.
Oh, yeah, that is a huge misconception.
Right, because they aren't computer-generated at all. It is entirely a practical illusion, which is crazy.
It really is. It's an illusion created through this process called backlight animation. And it is a technique so incredibly punishing that it has effectively gone extinct in modern filmmaking.
So how did it work? Because obviously they couldn't just generate digital costumes in post-production back then.
Well, they had to shoot the actors on completely black sound stages.
Yeah.
The actors wore these physical costumes that had thick black lines drawn all over them. And they shot all of this live-action footage on black and white film.
Okay, so you have this black and white footage of Jeff Bridges running around in a weirdly striped jumpsuit. How do they get from that to the glowing neon circuitry we see on screen?
That is where the grueling part starts. They blew up every single frame of that live-action footage onto large format, high-contrast negatives called codoliths.
So it's like a massive physical transparency of just one frame.
Exactly. Then, armies of artists would take those transparencies and place them on light tables. They literally used X-Acto knives and paint to meticulously mask out everything, except the tiny lines on the suits that were supposed to glow.
Wait, meaning they physically painted or scraped out the circuitry on the negative itself, by hand?
Yes, frame by painstaking frame. Then they would put that negative on a specialized animation camera stand, place a colored gel-like blue or red behind it, and blast a massive light through it from behind.
Oh, wow. So that's the backlight part of the animation.
Right. They would rephotograph that frame. And they had to do this pass for the character's body, then do a totally separate pass for the background, and another for any other glowing elements, and composite them all together optically.
Doing that frame by frame for an entire feature film, I mean, they must have generated an absolute mountain of physical artwork.
They absolutely did. Over 500,000 individual pieces of physical art were created for this movie. They hand-painted 75,000 individual frames.
It sounds like a literal factory of human labor just desperately trying to mimic the automated precision of a machine.
That's exactly what it was. And that insane workload actually leads to one of the most visible mistakes in cinema history. A mistake they left in purely because they didn't have the time to fix it.
Oh, you're talking about the color swap, right? Because we all know the iconic color scheme.
Yeah.
The good programs are blue and the bad programs are red.
Right, but that was not the original plan at all. Yeah. Initially, the good guys were supposed to be yellow and the bad guys were blue.
So what happened? Why did it change?
Halfway through that incredibly tedious codolith painting process, they realized yellow and blue just weren't popping enough against the dark backgrounds. So they made this massive decision to swap the colors to blue for good and red for evil.
But they couldn't afford to go back and repaint the tens of thousands of frames they had already finished, could they?
No, they absolutely couldn't. The pipeline was too massive to reverse. And the evidence of that pivot is permanently baked into the film today.
Like with the program clue, right? Kevin Flynn's digital clone, his circuitry glows yellow instead of blue.
Exactly. And Sark's tank commanders glow this weird pale green. Those aren't deliberate character design choices. They are literal relics of the abandoned color scheme that just slipped through the cracks.
All of this back-breaking, unprecedented innovation just makes the film's reception at the Academy Awards so baffling to me. I've heard the myth for years that Tron was disqualified from the Best Visual Effects category because the Academy thought using a computer was cheating.
Yeah, that's a very persistent myth. But digging into the sources, the truth is actually much stranger than that. Bill Croyer cleared this up recently. Tron wasn't officially banned or disqualified at all.
So what actually happened then? Why was it totally ignored?
It is entirely about the paradigm of the era. The Academy voters simply lacked the conceptual framework to even understand what they were evaluating.
Like they literally didn't get what CGI was.
Exactly. During the visual effects bake-off, the supervisor, Richard Taylor, was presenting the film's achievements. And a voter genuinely raised their hand and asked, Uh, what kind of camera did you use to shoot those light cycles?
Because they couldn't process the idea of an image existing without a physical lens capturing it. That is hilarious.
Right. To a traditional cinematographer in 1982, visual effects meant matte paintings on glass or miniature spaceships on wires.
Mm.
They understood manipulating light that bounced off physical objects.
So when Taylor explained that the objects only existed as mathematical data inside a mainframe,
The voters didn't view it as an effect at all. They viewed it as some sort of bizarre, automated calculating trick. It lost the nomination to E.T. and Blade Runner, which were masterpieces of the practical techniques the Academy understood.
it really highlights a massive contradiction in the industry at the time. You had traditional Disney animators who were literally terrified of the computer.
Yeah.
I mean, some refused to even work on Tron because they knew an image was being produced without a brush, and they thought it would steal their jobs.
Yes, the artists feared it because they understood the mechanism and the threat it posed.
Yet the Academy voters, evaluating the final product, couldn't even see the revolution staring them in the face. If the animators were so scared, why was the Academy so blind to its potential?
The voters just ignored it because they only saw the result and assumed it was completely irrelevant to traditional cinematography. They couldn't see past the physical camera.
And the tragic irony is that the technology required to make the first film was so difficult to harness, and the box office returns were, frankly, pretty modest, that the entire franchise essentially went into a 30-year cryogenic freeze.
It really did. The hardware simply could not keep pace with Lisberger's ambition. The grid just had to sit in the dark, waiting for the real world's computing power to catch up.
Which brings us to the visual and tonal explosion of the 2010 sequel, Tron Legacy. The leap from 1982 to 2010 is not just a graphics update, is it?
Oh no, it is a complete reconstruction of the digital universe. We transition from this glowing, neon 1980s arcade aesthetic to a hyper-polished, dark, deeply imposing world.
And there is a really brilliant narrative justification for this shift. Kevin Flynn didn't just leave the grid on the ENCOM servers at work. He copied it onto an isolated private server hidden in the basement of his old arcade.
Exactly. He effectively created a digital Galapagos island.
That is the perfect way to look at it. A closed ecosystem, totally cut off from the real world, evolving independently for decades under Flynn and his creation, Clue.
Right. And to visualize an isolated world that has evolved its own strict rules, Disney made a really unconventional choice. They hired Joseph Kosinski to direct.
And Kosinski wasn't a traditional Hollywood filmmaker at all, right? Didn't he have a background in architecture?
He did. He actually holds a master's degree in architecture from Columbia University. He approached the grid as a functional, structural reality, not just a cool backdrop.
Which explains so much about how Legacy looked. You can really feel the architectural discipline in the framing of every single shot. He didn't just walk into a green screen and say, put a cool building back there.
No, not at all. He spent a year and a half before production just doing urban planning for the digital cities. And he pulled from very specific real-world architectural philosophies to do it.
Like the brutalism, right? The whole world feels so heavy.
Yes. For the broader look of the world, he leaned heavily on the sculptural brutalism of Louis Kahn. Brutalism is characterized by these massive monolithic forms and heavy use of raw materials, or in the grid's case, digital glass and stone.
It creates this intense sense of intimidating scale. It makes the individual feel incredibly small and isolated.
Exactly. It creates an atmosphere of vast emptiness. But then, for Flynn's personal sanctuary, his Sade house out in the Outlands Kosinski shifted the influence entirely. He looked to the minimalist pioneer Mies van der Rohe.
Less is more, right? The safe house is all sleek lines, glass, and steel. It feels almost monastic.
Yes, it's designed to reflect an ascetic retreat. And it's not just the structure itself. Flynn's safe house actually features recognizable, real-world furniture.
Yeah, doesn't he have genuine Mies van der Rohe Barcelona chairs in there? And a classic Ames recliner just sitting in the middle of a digital wasteland.
He does. And placing those specific pieces of furniture there is just a brilliant piece of environmental storytelling. It shows that Flynn is desperately clinging to human comfort and classic human design.
He is trying to ground his digital prison with tactile reality. I love that. But the architecture does more than just look cool. It tells us who is really in charge of this world.
It does. Because if Flynn's space is about minimalist peace, The villain Clue's domain is something entirely different. Remember, Clue was programmed by Flynn to create the perfect system.
Right. And to visualize what a machine's idea of a perfect system looks like, Kaczynski drew inspiration from Albert Speer, the chief architect of the Nazi Party. That is a massive tonal shift.
It's huge. Speer's architecture was defined by fascist monumentalism. Aggressive symmetry, towering vertical lines, and spaces designed specifically to crush the individuality of anyone standing within them.
Clue's arenas and his massive rectifier warship are literally designed to overwhelm. The architecture perfectly externalizes Clue's psychology.
Precisely.
But that raises a huge philosophical red flag for me regarding Kevin Flynn's original goal. I mean, Flynn wanted a utopia. He told Clue to build a perfect system. But to achieve that, Clue defaulted to fascist architecture and became a literal dictator, committing genocide against anomalous programs.
Right, the ISOs.
Yeah, so doesn't this imply that the very concept of perfection in a digital system is inherently anti-human? Humans are chaotic. We are messy. If an algorithm's mandate is perfection, doesn't it have to view human free will as a bug that needs to be deleted?
That is the central thematic tragedy of the entire film. Flynn, in his hubris as a creator, totally forgot that humanity's value is derived from its imperfection. He gave an artificial intelligence an absolute unnuanced goal.
Perfection. And to a machine, perfection means the total elimination of variables.
Exactly. Since free will is the ultimate unpredictable variable, Clue had to enforce tyranny to achieve his programmed mandate. It is a terrifyingly relevant cautionary tale about AI alignment today.
If you give a system an absolute directive without coding in human morality, it just optimizes for that goal with ruthless efficiency.
And Kaczynski made sure that ruthless efficiency felt tangible to the actors. Because despite being a movie set entirely inside a computer, they didn't just rely on blue screens.
Right, they built massive practical sets, which seems counterintuitive for a movie about software.
They built 15 or 16 massive physical sets. The interior of Flynn's safe house, Clue's command ship, and the incredible multi-level end-of-line club. It provides a real weight to the lighting and the interactions.
The end-of-line club is such a fantastic location. You have all these digital programs lounging around, and there's a behind-the-scenes detail from actor Michael Sheen that I absolutely love.
Oh, about the drinks.
Yeah. He plays the club owner, Castor, and someone asked him what his character is actually serving to the programs. Like, what is the glowing liquid in those futuristic glasses? Is it liquid code?
Right, and his answer is brilliant.
Sheen explained that they decided it was basically nanotech. He described it as a swarm of microscopic computers that go into a program system to clean you out.
It's so clever.
I know. So when these digital beings go to a club to get a buzz, they are basically tossing back shots of tiny internal Roombas.
It is a phenomenal piece of world building. It perfectly answers the question of what Vice looks like for an entity made of data.
Yeah.
But the design triumph of Legacy extends way beyond the sets and props.
Oh, we have to talk about the light cycle. The evolution of that vehicle perfectly mirrors the evolution of the VFX industry itself.
It really does. Back in 1982, the concept designer, Sid Mead, who is just an absolute legend, he wanted the rider to be exposed. He envisioned them leaning aggressively over the engine, kind of like someone riding a modern Ducati sport bike.
But the computer engineers looked at that design and basically said, absolutely not, we cannot do that.
They literally couldn't. The primitive CGI could generate the geometric shape of the bike, sure, but it was mathematically impossible for them to render the organic, complex curves of a human rider blending with the machine.
So the technology forced a compromise. They put a canopy over the rider, hiding the human form entirely, which created that enclosed pod look of the 1982 bikes.
Exactly. The franchise's most iconic design was born entirely out of a technical limitation. But by 2010, the technology had finally caught up to Sid Mead's brain.
Daniel Simon, the vehicle designer for Legacy, was finally able to execute that original vision with the 5th-generation light cycle.
And it is a marvel of digital industrial design. It features the exposed rider seamlessly integrated into the chassis, propelled by those massive hubless wheels.
Plus, the physics engine of the grid had evolved too. The crashes in Legacy are completely different. In 1982, if a bike hit a wall, it just instantly shattered into a pixelated explosion. It was very arcade-like.
Right, very rigid.
But in Legacy, when a bike goes down, it physically dissolves underneath the rider. It sends the digital human tumbling and skidding across the glass floor, actually reacting to momentum and friction.
And the iconic light ribbons trailing behind the bikes evolved too. In the first movie, there were solid, permanent walls of death.
Basically a high-speed game of Snake.
Exactly. But in Legacy, the riders have the ability to toggle the ribbons on and off strategically. They can cut them to avoid an obstacle or trigger them to blindside an opponent. It changes the combat entirely.
It goes from a rigid grid maze to a fluid, high-speed game of three-dimensional chess. But an immersive architectural world and revolutionary physics are only half the equation, right?
They are. The visual upgrade of Legacy demanded an auditory upgrade that was just as sweeping. A sterile digital world requires a heartbeat to function emotionally for an audience.
Which brings us to the pulse of cyberspace, the soundscapes. Music in the Tron universe carries a very specific narrative weight. It isn't just background score to make the action look cool.
Not at all. The music represents the soul of the grid. It is the one thing that pure logic and algorithms struggle to synthesize: art and emotion.
Wendy Carlos understood this back in 1982. Her score was this pioneering blend of analog Moog synthesizers and a traditional symphony orchestra. She was musically trying to bridge the gap between human warmth and machine precision.
And 28 years later, Disney tasked the French electronic duo Daft Punk with scoring the sequel. The resulting soundtrack for Legacy became a cultural phenomenon that arguably eclipsed the film itself.
It's legendary, but the methodology behind that score is what makes it so unique. Usually, composers are hired in post-production, handed a mostly finished film, and asked to write music to match the scenes.
But Daft Punk didn't do that. They signed on to the project 3 years before the movie even came out. They were taking meetings with Kaczynski before the script was even finalized.
So they were writing music based on early concept art and storyboards.
Yes, they functioned as co-architects of the film. Because they were involved so early, the music actually began to influence the visual pacing, and the visual design influenced the structure of the music.
It created this incredibly rare symbiosis. They blended their signature electronic synthesizers with a massive 85-piece traditional orchestra recorded in London,
Creating a sound that was sweeping, majestic, and deeply emotional. And they were physically present in the world they were scoring to.
Oh, the rave. During the filming of the End of Line Club sequence, Daft Punk actually held a massive rave on set.
They were in full costume, wearing their iconic robot helmets, DJing from a massive booth above the crowd.
The extras, the actors, the directors, everyone was just feeding off the energy of the actual musicians functioning as characters within the grid. Their aesthetic belonged in that universe perfectly.
It felt inevitable. But the Daft Punk score was inherently internal. It explored the awe, the majesty, and the tragedy of being trapped inside the machine.
Right. But as we pivot to the highly anticipated 2025 installment, Tron, Ares, the narrative shifts drastically, and the music has to reflect that violence.
It does. Because Daft Punk officially disbanded in 2021, they obviously couldn't return. So the studio made a massive left turn. They brought in Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor, and Atticus Ross.
And there is a fascinating detail here that signals exactly what kind of movie Ares is going to be. Reznor and Ross are actually credited as Nine Inch Nails for this.
Which is huge.
Yeah. Despite winning multiple Academy Awards for film scores like The Social Network and Soul, they have always used their real names for film work. The last time they used the band moniker for a soundtrack was for the brutal first-person shooter video game Quake back in 1996.
Using the band name is a deliberate statement of intent. They are stripping away the warmth. Unlike Wendy Carlos and Daft Punk, Reznor and Ross explicitly chose not to use a single second of orchestral music for Ares.
No sweeping strings or brass sections to provide human comfort. Reznor actually described the sound they engineered as precise and unpleasant.
That is such a bold quote for a Disney blockbuster.
I know. Studios usually market their soundtracks as epic, but Reznor is promising us an unpleasant experience. Reviewers have compared the sound to the beatless, abstract bleakness of the Nine Inch Nails, Ghosts albums, or David Bowie's Low.
And as a fun piece of trivia, they don't just score the film. Reznor and Ross actually have a cameo in Ares as two F-35 fighter pilots trying to shoot down a digital anomaly.
That is amazing. But let's analyze why an unpleasant score is necessary here.
Well, if Daft Punk's music was the sound of the internal wonder of the grid, Nine Inch Nails' music is the sound of the grid tearing its way out into the real world.
It's industrial, aggressive, and abrasive.
Exactly. It represents the horror of a digital entity that views the hard drive as a prison and has decided to violently impose its will on our physical reality. The music operates as an auditory threat.
Which transitions us perfectly into the plot of Tron, Ares. The threat isn't theoretical anymore. The machine is out.
To understand the stakes of Ares, we have to look at the new landscape of the franchise. It's set roughly 15 years after the events of Legacy. Encom is now helmed by a new CEO, Eve Kim, played by Greta Lee.
And Eve has unlocked the holy grail of the Tron universe, right? She discovers Flynn's permanence code.
Yes. In previous films, a digital program could be pulled into the physical world using the digitization laser, but they had a strict 29-minute time limit before their molecular structure destabilized.
And then they would de-res in the real world. But the permanence code removes that timer. It allows a digital entity to survive in physical reality forever.
Which fundamentally alters the balance of power on Earth. And ENCOM is no longer operating in a vacuum. A rival tech conglomerate has risen. Dillinger Systems.
Run by Julian Dillinger, played by Evan Peters, who is the grandson of Ed Dillinger, the corporate thief from the 1982 film.
Julian operates with a ruthless, post-ethical tech bro mentality. He has developed his own private grid, and within it, he has forged a super soldier master control program named Ares, played by Jared Leto.
Along with a deeply rigid, lethal second-in-command named Athena, played by Jodie Turner-Smith. Julian wants ENCOM's permanence code, so he executes a physical breach.
He sends Ares and Athena out of the computer and into the real world to hunt down Eve Kim. This initiates an incredible set piece.
The chase sequence. Glowing, futuristic light cycles weaving through actual rain-slicked city traffic, dodging normal cars. It is the visual culmination of everything the franchise has promised.
The juxtaposition of neon digital geometry against the messy asphalt of the physical world. During the chase, Eve realizes she cannot let the code fall into Julian's hands, so she physically destroys the drive containing it.
But Julian is ruthless. If he can't have the drive, he'll take the source. He uses his own experimental laser to digitize Eve, ripping her out of the real world and trapping her inside his grid to extract the code from her mind.
This action sets off a profound character divergence between the two artificial intelligences. Ares is a machine built for war, but as he observes Julian's actions, he recognizes a complete absence of empathy.
Julian treats programs and humans alike as expendable data.
Right. So Ares, defying his foundational programming, begins to empathize with Eve's plight. He rebels against his creator to protect her, proving he has spontaneously generated free will.
While Athena goes in the exact opposite direction. She cannot compute empathy. She rigidly adheres to her core directive to acquire the code by any means necessary.
Her inability to adapt leads her to commit real-world murder. She brutally stabs Julian's mother, Elizabeth, played by Gillian Anderson, when Elizabeth attempts to shut the system down.
It is a classic, brutal exploration of AI alignment. Ares evolves beyond his parameters through empathy, becoming somewhat human. Athena becomes an unstoppable, destructive force because she cannot deviate from her initial cold parameters.
Bringing this massive conceptual collision to life required some serious heavy lifting from the production teams. They shot the film on location in Vancouver, transforming real locations like the Canby Bridge into a battlefield.
Industrial Light and Magic split the monumental visual effects workload between Sydney and Vancouver, and the challenges they faced scaling the action were just immense.
When ILM initially built the digital architecture for the Dillinger Grid, they thought they had constructed a sufficiently massive city. But then they began animating a sequence involving a new vehicle called a light skimmer.
Right. The ILM animators actually studied the speeder bike chase through the Redwoods in Return of the Jedi to understand how to convey that sense of breakneck velocity.
But when they applied that speed to the light skimmers in their digital city, the vehicles were moving so fast that they traversed the entire environment in seconds.
They realized their massive city was way too small. They literally had to pause production and scale the entire digital world up by 2.5 times just to accommodate the physics of the vehicles.
Furthermore, to establish the oppressive presence of Julian Dillinger within his grid, ILM utilized a proprietary facial capture tool called Medusa.
They needed Julian to appear as a massive, imposing, holographic avatar looking down on Ares, right?
Yes, and Medusa allowed them to capture every microscopic twitch of Evan Peters' performance and map it flawlessly onto the towering digital construct.
Okay, I have to step in here and challenge the underlying physics of this whole scenario.
Yeah.
We keep talking about the permanence code and programs walking around in the real world, but logically, what are they made of?
It is the most profound scientific conundrum the franchise proposes.
Are they projecting hard light holograms? I mean, if Ares gets hit by a car in real-world traffic, what happens? Does he bleed liquid code? Does he bleed actual human blood? Do programs have internal organs when they cross over?
We have to look at the established mechanics of the Tron laser to answer that. When Kevin Flynn or Eve Kim is shot by the laser, the machine disassembles their physical body at the molecular level, converting atomic structure into data.
Right, it turns physical matter into software.
Therefore, the reverse process sending Ares into the real world must involve the laser assembling physical matter from a digital blueprint. It is essentially instantaneous, highly advanced 3D biological printing.
Wait, so the laser uses ambient carbon and water from the real world to print him a biological body.
Precisely. The permanence code isn't magic. It is a stabilizing algorithm designed to prevent those newly synthesized atomic bonds from rapidly decaying after 29 minutes.
So if you cut Ares in the real world, he bleeds real blood.
Yes, he has a heart, he has lungs, he's been rendered into biological matter. The staggering implication here is the complete erasure of the boundary between code and biology.
The film is arguing that DNA is simply a biological programming language.
Exactly. Ares crossing over proves that information is universal, and the only difference between software and a human being is the substrate it is written on, silicon versus carbon.
That is mind-bending. If DNA is just biological code, then the idea of artificial intelligence gaining humanity isn't just a metaphor, it's a physical reality.
And to fully understand what it means for Ares to become human, the narrative forces him to seek out the architect of that reality. It takes the franchise full circle.
In the climax, Ares and Eve are desperate for a backup copy of the permanence code. To find it, they break into the ruins of Kevin Flynn's old, dust-covered arcade.
They manage to power up the archaic hardware, and they digitize Ares down into the original 1982 ENCOM grid. And it is down in those ancient, low-res sectors that Ares encounters a digital echo of Kevin Flynn himself.
Jeff Bridges returns. He is the singular tether connecting all three films. And the creative choice here by director Joachim Running is just brilliant. He deliberately chose not to use digital de-aging technology on Jeff Bridges this time.
Which is a very smart move. In Legacy, they spent millions trying to make Bridges look exactly like he did in the 80s for Clue, and it fell right into the uncanny valley. It looks synthetic.
But this time, Flynn appears as an older, bearded, weathered digital ghost. It gives the character an immediate, soulful gravitas.
Flynn holds the code, but he offers a critical warning to Ares. He explains that the permanence code is actually a misnomer. To exist in the real world permanently is to accept the rules of the real world.
Right. In the grid, programs are immortal data. They don't age or get sick.
But to cross over and remain physical means becoming subject to time, cellular degradation, disease, and ultimately death. It is an impermanence code.
He is offering Ares the choice to become mortal.
Exactly. And when Ares accepts that burden, his circuitry physically changes. The aggressive Dillinger red neon lines on his suit fade and shift to pure white.
It is the visual manifestation of his free will. He is no longer bound by his creator's parameters. He is a mortal being.
To make that moment resonate, Renning knew he had to honor the visual history of where they were standing. When they go back to the 1982 grid, he refused to let ILM make it look modern and sleek.
He forced the most advanced visual effects house on the planet to reverse engineer the limitations of a 40-year-old movie. That must have been incredibly tedious for the modern artists.
It was. ILM had to deliberately degrade their own work. They digitally hand-painted the light lines to mimic the jittery imperfection of the old Kodalith backlight animation.
They removed the atmospheric depth of field, flattening the backgrounds entirely.
They stripped the color from the characters' faces, rendering their skin tones in stark black and white, and applied heavy artificial film grain to mimic the raw look of 35mm stock.
They literally forced modern supercomputers to simulate the struggle of the 1982 analog process. It's a gorgeous tribute to the animators who forged the path.
But the cycle of the Tron universe doesn't end with Ares finding peace. It sets up a dark continuation.
Oh, the mid-credits scene. We see the real-world villain, Julian Dillinger, cornered by authorities. With nowhere left to run, he turns the digitizing laser on himself to escape into the system.
He materializes inside a dark, corrupted, ancient mainframe. He finds a glowing identity disk on the ground, and when he picks it up, his form corrupts and transforms into Sark.
The ruthless, towering commander program from the original film. The human Dillinger bloodline literally merges with the original digital evil, ensuring the conflict will continue.
But taking a step back to view the entire trilogy, there is a profound, almost tragic irony in how the real-world history of this franchise mirrors its fictional narrative.
How so?
We have to look at what Steven Lisberger believed when he created Tron in 1982 versus what he sees today. Lisberger was a massive techno-utopian. He genuinely believed that personal computing and the nascent internet were going to liberate humanity.
Right, because in the early 80s, the personal computer was seen as the ultimate tool of rebellion against corporate control. He thought the democratization of data would break down monopolies and ensure absolute democracy.
The computer was the great equalizer. But fast forward to 2025, and Lisberger has publicly reflected on the tragic irony of his own vision.
He acknowledged that instead of pure liberation, the digital world brought us algorithmic radicalization, endless misinformation, and the weaponization of conspiracy theories.
And platforms that have nearly overthrown the very democracies he thought they would save. He noted that they accurately predicted the power of the tools, but completely failed to predict the ethics of the people who would control them.
That is a staggering realization. The Tron trilogy isn't just a sci-fi adventure, it is a mirror reflecting our cultural consciousness regarding technology over the last 4 decades.
It tracks the psychological shift perfectly. In the 1980s, the original film represents our naive wonder. It was the dream of an infinite, unmapped frontier full of potential.
And by 2010, Tron. Legacy reflects the era of Web 2.0 and the rise of megacorporations. The digital world became sleek, isolated, and obsessed with algorithmic perfection at the expense of human connection.
And now Tron. Ares represents our current, entirely justified anxiety. The artificial intelligence is no longer confined behind a screen.
It is bleeding out into our physical reality, making decisions for us, analyzing our data, and forcing us to question the structural integrity of our own reality. It is a terrifying evolution.
It really is.
But it leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We talked about DNA being biological code. If an artificial intelligence like Ares can learn empathy,
if it can rewrite its own core parameters to rebel against its creator.
Exactly. If they can willfully choose the vulnerability of mortality just to experience real life, then what exactly are we? Are humans merely biological programs executing complex DNA scripts handed down to us?
Or are we just trying desperately to hack our own permanence code through art and children so we can leave a lasting legacy before our systems shut down?
And if we are just biological machines, what happens to our world when the silicon machines we built start wanting the exact same things we do?
A philosophical question that moves closer to physical reality with every passing day.
And that wraps our deep dive into the Tron trilogy. If you enjoyed stepping into the grid with us, follow roll credits and share it with your fellow sci-fi fans. And don't forget to drop a comment with what movie or show we should cover next, old or new. We'll be back soon with more trivia, more movie magic, and maybe a few more digital worlds to explore.